everyone. Today I'm doing a book review on one of my favorite books I read recently, by one of my favorite authors, Alejo Carpentier, who is famous as a Cuban author, although he spent quite a bit of time also in France, and his mother was, I think, French and his father was Russian. It might have been the other way around. His father was French and his mother was Russian, but he was born in Cuba and spent a good bit of his life in Cuba. So let's jump in. Alejo Carpentier. I've read several books by him. I use The Kingdom of This World in one of my courses. But here today we're talking about Explosion in a Cathedral, which originally in Spanish was titled El Siglo. Boy, I got to check my spelling before I do these recordings. El Siglo de las Luces in Spanish. Written and published in 1962. A more literal translation of the English title would be The Century of Lights or The Age of Enlightenment. But the English version is titled Explosion in a Cathedral, based on a visual recurring motif in the book, based on this painting from 1630. This is a painting by, I forget the first name, but someone de Nome, a French artist, 1630. It shows a cathedral just in the moment of exploding outward. You can see some bricks or stones flying. And this is a painting hanging on the wall of a house in Havana in the beginning of the book. And the book returns to this painting over and over throughout the book and to the end. And obviously Carpentier is saying something about the message or the meaning of the book with this painting. And so in English they gave it the name Explosion in a Cathedral. This is a picture of the book cover, Explosion in a Cathedral. 1962. Notice it was written shortly after the Cuban Revolution. And Carpentier, of course, was Cuban. He was a supporter of the Cuban Revolution, at least in the early phase. And so he wrote this book about the Age of Enlightenment, or the Explosion in a Cathedral. This book takes place in about a 18-year period from around 1789, 1790 through 1808. Precisely during the French Revolution, and then later the rise of Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars. And the book takes place mostly in the Caribbean, although it weaves back and forth between the Caribbean and Europe. So the narrative for the book begins shortly before the Haitian Revolution, which followed the French Revolution, and it covers the 1790s and the early 1800s. There's a lot of geographical movement in this book. The book starts out, the first chapter, in Cuba, in a house of some Cuban merchants. The father has just died, and the protagonists of the story are his 3 orphaned children. So it starts out in Cuba. It moves fairly quickly to Haiti for just a brief period, and because of the turmoil and the violence that's going on in Haiti, the protagonists are forced to go to France to get away from Haiti. There's no boats going back to Cuba, so they take the next boat, which is going to France. And then from France, the action moves from Europe back to the Caribbean, to the French island of Guadaloupe, which is down in the Lesser Antilles, in the Windward Islands, near Dominica. The French island of Guadaloupe. And then back to Cuba again. And then it moves back to the mainland of South America with the capital city Cayenne of French Guiana. And then the book finally ends in Spain, Madrid, Spain, in 1808. So this book, if you are a fan of Atlantic civilization, which I am, this book will be a fascinating exercise. It's a multinational book set in the context of the Atlantic civilization during a time of tremendous upheaval and rapid change. Atlantic civilization is a construct for the purposes of study, which presupposes a civilization that includes Western Europe, Western Africa, the Americas, and of course the Caribbean. And so this was the triangle trade of the American slave, or the slave trade, in which Europeans would set out from Europe, go to Africa, barter and trade and purchase African slaves, bring them to the Caribbean or to Brazil, as the case may be, sell them in exchange for rum, sugar, other New World products, tobacco, and then travel back to Europe or perhaps to the British colonies of North America. So this is called the triangular trade, and this was the basis of the idea of an Atlantic civilization. Of course, it fully founded on the slave trade and the mass production of sugar with slave labor. And of course, in the American South, or the U.S. South, it was cotton. So Carpentier critiques idealism, ideologies, and naive political utopianism. He does this also in one of his other books, The Kingdom of This World, which is entirely about the Haitian Revolution. Carpentier seems to present the need for revolution, for changing social structures and systemic systems, but he's skeptical that revolution can ever succeed in improving the human condition. Interestingly, Carpentier wrote this book just about 3 years after the Cuban Revolution itself, and as I read it, I was trying to think about what he might be saying about the Cuban Revolution. It's hard to say, but he does seem skeptical about the revolutionary outcomes, at least based on his view of the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution. He starts the narrative of explosion in a cathedral in Havana, in the home of these three Cuban orphans. A figure shows up, Victor Hughes, and becomes involved with the three orphans and becomes sort of like a surrogate mentor or father for them. So it starts there in Havana, but then it goes to Haiti and to Europe and to South America, and then back to Europe. So one of the things that Carpentier is reflecting in this book is his own sense of being divided between his Caribbean or his Cuban identity and his European identity. And so he's trying to weave these together and create a sort of a communication or a dialogue between Europe and the Caribbean. Carpentier is a master of detailed historic description. Carlos and Sofia and Esteban are the three fictional characters. Carlos and Sofia are natural siblings, and Esteban is like a cousin or an adoptive sibling. They're all recently orphaned Cuban kids from a prosperous merchant family. The father has just died. The mother had died sometime before. They are living their last period of their childhood, and they've got a couple servants of color, but they have no parental authority in their life until Victor Hughes shows up. And Victor Hughes is an actual historical character that you can look up information about him in history. He was a baker in Haiti and a small-time merchant. His bakery was destroyed by the Haitian Revolution. He lost his goods, his warehouse. He ended up traveling to France, where he became embroiled in the French Revolution. He was a fan of Robespierre and a follower and loyal servant of his. He later was sent by Robespierre with a small ragtag French fleet to liberate the island of Guadaloupe, the French island, from the British, who were in control. And somehow, and this is a historical fact, he miraculously achieved victory against a superior British fleet, with very little experience and with a much smaller force. He manages to defeat the British and liberate the island of Guadeloupe from the British. He arrives in Guadeloupe as a savior for those who are sympathetic to the French Revolution, also for the people of color, because he's carrying a declaration of the end of slavery from the French Directorate. In addition, he's carrying a guillotine on his ship to enforce the decrees of the French Revolution. Carlos and Sophia recede out of the narrative early on in the first few chapters, and it's only Esteban who is the witness of Victor Hughes in France. So Esteban goes with Hughes to France. Esteban is sympathetic with the revolution. He's committed to the revolution, but he's also a critical thinker. And as the chapters go on during his time in France and southern France, he's sent to do translations on the border of France in Spain, translating French revolutionary documents into Spanish in order to try to whip up support for the revolution in Spain. This doesn't go very well. He's dissatisfied on the border within the Basque Country and finds out that Victor Hughes is being sent back to the Caribbean with a fleet to fight the British in Guadeloupe. And so Esteban appeals and asks him if he could go with him. Victor agrees, and so Esteban is back on the ship with Victor Hughes on his way back to the Caribbean. And of course, the story gives a version of how Victor Hughes achieves this unlikely victory over the British, which he actually, in fact, did in history. And then it reveals that he has brought a guillotine to the New World to enforce revolutionary decrees, and Victor, little by little, becomes a monster of the revolution and ends up sending large numbers of people to have their heads cut off with the guillotine. Esteban gradually becomes disillusioned with the revolution and with Victor Hughes, but Hughes gives him an assignment to travel with some French or Guadeloupean ships or French ships to carry out hit-and-run piracy against the British and the Spanish, who were at war with France at one time or another. So then later, Esteban is sent to French Guiana, where he's supposed to arrive there and distribute revolutionary materials and distribute them into Suriname and hopefully get them into other parts of South America, Venezuela. But Esteban is finally able to escape to Suriname and find his way back to Cuba. Victor Hughes was recalled to France in disgrace near the end of this period. But once again, he lands on his feet when he finds favor with the newly ascendant Napoleon. So Napoleon sends Victor Hughes back to Cayenne, the capital of French Guiana, as the governor. This time his orders are to reinstate slavery and foment revolutionary sentiment in South America. And this time it is not Esteban, but it's Sophia who's our fictional witness to what's going on with Victor and the French Revolution. Sophia's husband dies. She has always carried a secret attraction to Victor, and so she sells out some of her goods and buys a ticket on a ship and travels to French Guiana, where she joins Victor and becomes his lover. And now it's her turn to gradually become disenchanted with the high ideals of the revolution. So she eventually leaves Victor and goes to Spain. Esteban is arrested in Cuba for his sympathy with the French Revolution, and he's sent to prison in Spain. And so Sophia spent several years she finally manages to get Esteban released from prison, and he joins her in Madrid, and they live a quiet life in Madrid until until Napoleon sends his troops through Spain on their way to Portugal, and they occupy Madrid, and they forcibly remove the Spanish king from the throne and impose Napoleon's brother Jose or Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish people. And the book ends with a final explosion of violence the Spanish people rising up against the French invading troops. And here's a couple of paintings from Goya of the one on the left is called the 2nd of May, which is the day that the Spanish rose up and fought the French hand-to-hand combat through the streets of Madrid. And the 3rd of May is after midnight of that day when the French go around executing the Spanish stragglers, survivors, and basically put them to death. And so this is how the book ends, in an explosion in Madrid. Not necessarily a cathedral, but in Madrid. So we're left wondering, what is the explosion in the cathedral? Is it an explosion of Western civilization through the French Revolution? Is it an explosion and a disruption of the historic Christian church? Is it an explosion in the old ancien regime of nobility in Europe? It certainly is an explosion in the Americas, where the second, 3rd of May set off a chain of events in South America that begins in Argentina and Venezuela, but inevitably leads to the Spanish Wars of Independence, which continue the violence on for another 20 years, after a very violent 1790s and early 1800s. Carpentier's writing and his vocabulary are simply extraordinary. Just to read him is to behold a work of art. He has encyclopedic knowledge of French, of France, of Cuba, of the Caribbean, of French culture, Cuban culture. His grasp of the historical detail of this period is unparalleled. I personally have come to appreciate being able to experience history through imagination and fiction, as well as to study it more empirically through historical disciplines. I experienced the end of the book as if it were an actual historical explosion. It's one of those endings that I was kind of up on my feet, saying "Ole" or "Oh me" or "Oh my God." It just was that kind of an ending for me, as if it were an actual historical explosion. Everything came to a crescendo. Carpentier was a musicologist. He studied Afro-Cuban music. He was very familiar with classical music. And there is Carlos Fuentes is noted a certain musicality to his writing. So it's no surprising that he builds it up through the entire book and then ends the book with kind of an explosion, a crescendo. So I highly recommend this book to you if you're interested in Atlantic civilization, or if you're interested in finding out more about, to kind of experience the realities of the Atlantic slave trade or the French Revolution. This is an excellent book to do that. It also shows that the Spanish Caribbean was not isolated from the French Caribbean or the British Caribbean, but there was constant back and forth and interaction between them and with Europe, between these various aspects of Caribbean culture. Thank you very much. We'll talk to you again soon. Take care.